Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, council members. And Todd, I think we're teed up here, right on the.
I think so.
I have to find that.
I'll get it for you.
All right.
Go ahead.
Maybe a couple of points. When I was listening to the previous presentation by our county administrator and by our county attorney, we had a much smaller working group. The members are sitting in the room. Our representatives from the Conservation District. Conservation District also had a small working group prior to that. I was talking to the chairman on that working group, Mr. Marsh, a couple of times, and a few other engineers. So we had really a lot more technical input, but not a diverse group because it is a very technical topic. But on the other hand, we also have it grouped in various segments which sort of speak to what you had asked us to do after the presentation the district gave earlier this spring. And just like our attorney said, each one of these items can come forward individually or they come forward together. They do affect number of chapters in our code, and they affect chapter 90, 99, 115. So there's a number of chapters they affect. So having said that, as I said, it is in response to what you had asked us to do earlier in the spring. First, a little bit of a regulatory perspective. We have a stormwater ordinance. It's written in chapter 90, and it actually already references the still existing authority under Delaware Code. And that's important to note because if you look at the item D, district, county, municipality, or state or agency may develop the program in cooperation with any other governmental subdivision. We are a governmental subdivision, so we could work with the district on a memorandum which would cover some of these items on how we review them, inspect them, and or create the enforcement actions. So that authority still stands and is still the same as it was 30-some years ago. And Delaware Code wasn't amended. I actually looked it up. It still says the same thing. So this is one of the pictures you saw, and that was an outfall breach. And so that was going into the Rehoboth Bay right there at Herring Creek. And possible solutions to that. We have a buffer ordinance under 115, which limits the concentration of the zone B buffer to 50%. So you see this very minor buffer modification in the applications. In this particular case, the bridge happened right here, as you can see, and this was the minimum buffer at the time. If we had taken the entire B zone and stacked it into this drainage piece, it would have made a significant difference. So currently that's not allowed by code. That's a very easy change, and that would be a B zone buffer, and it would be based strictly on how the flow concentrates and where we would want to see that buffer stacked. We would put that in we already have a similar one under chapter 110, which is the sewer concept evaluation, and we would graft the language almost identical to that, where the engineering department makes a recommendation to the concentration of the B zone buffer. Pretty straightforward. And that doesn't even require a memorandum. We could do that today. Under the code currently, we have no specific recommendation of what practice should be used. We like to call this enhanced sediment capture. And the key thing here is a lot of these storms are really not the 100-year events, but they're definitely what we call the conveyance event, currently also referred to as the 10-year storm, which was the previous regulations on the DENREC called it the 10-year storm. Now it's called the CV, conveyance event. If we use that same event to size the sediment traps, even if we made no changes other than that, we could superimpose that and that would be more than the current sizing of 3,600 cubic feet per acre of limit of disturbance. We could also ask for or introduce that this would be done in a sequence of sediment trapping versus an individual trap. We could also use the last bullet, require, and that's probably the biggest hammer in this is if you're planning on anything but the infiltration practice, we could require that to be built and stabilized prior to start of construction. So again, this is a timing thing, which is not written in the NREG regulation. We believe we have the right to do so. So that would be something which would be strictly, it would just fall in the line of sequencing, and as the project would be sequenced on our documents and on the SED documents. It doesn't change anything other than the sequencing. And then this large facility becomes the sediment trap. It works for each one of these. It does not work for infiltration. But we would require that trap still be sized according to the first bullet, and then you have to bypass the infiltration practice. So when you look at this and how can we incorporate this in the process, that is pretty simple. This is the subdivision process under 99. We currently already have a preliminary conference. Under that particular one, we already are allowed to introduce storm drainage topics in the preliminary conference. We will expand that to bring in the buffer concentration and the enhanced sediment trapping. So that means we would see it very early on in the process. It would be right there together with the planning department. And we already have some input there, but these would be two other items the engineering department would have input on. So if you chose either one of these, we would also amend 99 to stick it in there in the preliminary conference. So this becomes a well-known discussion point very, very early on in the development process. So these are the sort of some of the bigger topics. Either one of them can be standalone, and then either one would go into the preliminary conference. So when you look at this, what you see here, that's why I picked this one. This is the single line of silt fence, which is currently done as per the state regulations. That's what's called perimeter control. And that perimeter control was, let's say, willfully inadequate in this particular case. So we made a couple of suggestions, and I just noticed today, after all this time I looked through this, the first one didn't get a bullet, so there should be an extra bullet up here. So what we like to do is introduce any of the following. It could be one or all of them. Today, even so, EPA says to slice silt fence. State regulations do not require it, so everything is trenched. And they use a trencher, and that trencher essentially creates an automatic washdown. So EPA realized this many, many years ago. I think a very simple thing, just to say follow EPA guidelines on the installation. That would be the lowest hanging fruit of low hanging fruits. But it would eliminate that loose dirt trench where the silt fence is in. And currently, the requirement is 100 feet per 10,000 square feet of disturbed area. That's probably one of the, let's call it what it is, it's probably one of the stupidest regulations I've seen, because it just puts the silt fence around the LOD, and we all know that the majority of the limited area does not see any runoff. But you're putting in silt fence essentially as a delineation, not as a protection. So we like to think about it as, let's just say we can control the installation. We won't change the number, but we will change the installation, where it goes and how it's installed. The J-hook style lines with multiple continuous runs is already in the APA line. So EPA already realized that and recommended, but our regulations do not. They just say, put it around the LOD and trench it in. That's about, as I said, not very good. Instead of doing the limit of disturbance control of the air, the perimeter control with silt fence, you still want to see where it is, so you can use construction fence. Construction fence is significantly cheaper. It's not free, but it serves the same purpose on the high point as a silt fence, and it would indicate this is to where we clear, that's where we grade, that's what the area is which is under permit. Now we have used, two of our council members know our trials and tribulations at the big inland-based grading projects. You came on later, and two times we failed, even with multiple J-hook arrangements, to stop the runoff from North Field, where we essentially had 50 acres of bare dirt open during grading and rainstorms. The only thing we found that it would be stoppable were the terraced living walls. Now, that is a pretty big lift. We have a detail which we have developed, obviously, in our project, and we know it will stop pretty much a 100-year storm on bare earth. So this is, I'm not suggesting this, but this, if you wanted the Cadillac in an area where it would ply, and we would have to define where it should be applied. But we do know what works way above and beyond of silt fence. So here's this is probably the highest standard you can achieve. But all these fall under the same thing, perimeter controls. So the other one, and several of you and I talked about the limit of disturbance, and that has been in quite a topic. Would definitely require a memorandum with the district because they're the ones who would be reviewing and enforcing it. We would see it, but we would see it on the detailed grading plan, and I'm just jumping to that because that's one of them. So let me try to say these are all criteria where we could say under our code it should be limited, but it would be enforced through the district, that review. So let's start with the easy one. If you want to open ground between the timeline when there's no germination, you would be limited to what you have on that smaller area without ability to break additional ground. If you wanted to be, we have some really sensitive downstream resources, which we see during the resource assessment. And we could say, we would have to define what we consider sensitive and say if that applies, you would automatically, and that would be in our code, you would automatically see a reduction in limited disturbance area. What we don't see, but what the district sees, is the upstream drainage. They would see it in their submittals, and we could set threshold if you have certain upstream contributions, because here's your open area, which is counted, but if there's a large drainage area above it, and that all flows through there, then that is the one which is triggering the discharge. So this could be saying we have to have smaller limit of disturbance if we have a large upstream contribution, and that's also relatively easy to define. And that could actually be on-site or off-site. Let's say you have a 100-acre development, you're doing a 20-acre piece, but the other 80 acres of the same development flow through there. I've seen that happen several times. That would trigger that same criteria. It does not have to be off-site, it can be on-site. And we already talked about the topography. That's what did us in at the Inland Base project, because that regraded. When we regraded the field to our own grades and they were very mild, less than 2%, but before it was totally flat and had holes in it. So once we put the grades on, all of a sudden 50 acres were draining toward that one spot. And that's when we said we needed to have a smaller area. If we had cut that, if we ourselves cut it down in smaller LODs, we could have prevented that and wouldn't need a living wall to stop it. So lessons learned, these are hard lessons we learned on the inland bays regrading, but I think that knowledge was well used here in that particular world. So the limit of disturbance, again, I would like to see that definitely a standalone type piece, because it wants to live in that world. So that was then, when you look at that storm event here, that is what we call discharge at the boundary line. Remember, that breach did not occur at the outfall. It occurred at the lowest point, which happened to be adjacent to an existing subdivision, i.e. an outfall into a neighboring property during a storm event. So what can you do here? There's a couple of engineering tools you can apply, and that is, today we do not have to maintain volume and condition. It's much more nebulous. We have to maintain the quantity, the instantaneous flow rate, and there's some other language in there which says no downstream adverse impacts, which is much more nebulous. If we defined it as you have to maintain the flow condition, which means if it currently is sheet flow, it has to stay sheet flow. If it's currently concentrated shallow, it has to remain that. If it's concentrated right now, then we would say jump to the last one. We would prohibit concentrated discharges into proposed existing subdivisions. We would only allow these type of discharges to go into channels or downstream sewer systems. So any post-development discharge could not be into existing building lots or perimeter buffers. It would only go into open spaces, which would mean you would have to redirect some of these flows. So these would change how you calculate your post-development. And that is definitely, that review and enforcement would be in the world. But we could introduce it into into the Chapter 90 revisions. So these are more complex. That's a higher lift, because they're really highly technical issues which trigger actually how you calculate your runoffs. So, but again, if we are serious about preventing discharges of property lines, these are your tools. Now, you want to know, how can we give this some teeth? And that was Councilman Hudson's world when he wanted to, when we did our resource buffers, right? Probably the least desirable, and if Mr. Robertson's here, anybody who's been through the process of trying to levy fines and defend them in the court system would probably not recommend we do this. But there's a limit, and that's a stated limit in the regulatory process in the world of the discharge permits, the general construction general permits under the DENREG rules. It already has that limit, that national turbidity unit limit in there. So we would have to have our own staff take measurements with chain of custody, with duplicate samples, and generate that legal framework to do that, just to collect the fines, just to be appealed. I don't think whether that's a real practical thing to do, but it's certainly a possibility. I think the department, that's the engineering department, already has an agreement, a development agreement, for each phase we inspect. So it was very easy to write into this agreement that if you were to exceed these NTUs, that we would be not issuing any new building permits until that is rectified. All that control rests within the engineering department. The next bullet bites much harder. That rests in the planning department, and that all building inspections. That means any houses under partial construction would come to a screeching halt. So that really applies also if the perimeter control is not in place. And you remember you saw some of these during the building process, where the building contractors run over or remove the perimeter control. We could create a bullet in the inspection process, perimeter control breached, stop all inspections on that. That would fix that issue in a heartbeat. So keep that in mind. This will work across the board. And all we would need is all of our inspectors, from the engineering, from the zoning, from the building, all of them could have a box, perimeter controls breached. You will fill that room up easy. But that has a big bite. The last one is an interesting one, because we, as a subdivision of a state, could ask for the DNRC-issued permit to be suspended until this is done. So that would bring in through the back door the regulatory agency. You may see some regulatory backlash from the Senate, taking that right away from us, because that is sort of something, that is given to the state by EPA, that process. So I'm not so sure they're very interested in us meddling in this world between the federal agency and the state agency. But that is a possibility, which would, again, bring it to a dead stop for that phase. So even I learned a lot about these particular issues, like that in discussions with our friends from the district. They said, oh, you need to look at the EPA rules on that one, et cetera. So next steps for Councilman McCarron, he and I will be reappearing with the same presentation at the SED board. In the meantime, I encourage all of you to individually engage and let me know your preference, so I can establish something when we get back after the meeting with the board. We can say, oh, the following items got zero traction, but these here are more interesting. So we could be back as early as 8 weeks with a recommendation on which ones want to be packaged into a draft ordinance form. And just like earlier Mr. Lighthouse said, because these are touching items which require the planning commission, so we probably, once it gets to that level, we would put that condensed presentation before the planning commission, so we don't just jump that ordinance in front of them.
As far as this one, I'm not a fan of fines in most scenarios. Certainly item number 3, I don't think it's not good to see turbidity in the water, but nobody does it on purpose. And that's, you get a heavy rain event, and sometimes that happens. I would think number 3 is if something were to be done, if you were halting building inspections, you've got their attention, but that's something that rectify the problem, and they get back to their building inspections.
I mean, as I said, that's all you need.
Yeah. I think that's that's something they correct the action, back to work, but that would certainly motivate it without I don't think anybody is running around in an irresponsible manner, causing this, but I guess the enforcement option is how you make sure it's getting done or repaired.
I'm almost certain, Councilman, that depending on what you pick on the other ones, you're going to greatly reduce the number of times this may even be used.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, I don't think people are, doing it on purpose, but I think failing to take adequate precautions to guarantee that it doesn't happen, they're going to do what we require them to do. And, it's happened too many times on my watch. I don't want to. Now, interestingly, it's been a very wet summer, and unless I see Jessica's here from the district, and unless she can tell me differently, I have not seen a lot of instances in the last month or two of spillage, which is good. But I think that, builders are, they're in business to make money, and they're going to do what's required. And I think we have to raise the bar to a point that this guarantees that, we're not, because there's too much riding on it. We cannot afford to kill the grasses and the subaquatic life, with just accidents like that.
And Councilman, if I may say, this bullet 3 creates a link between the development entity and the building entity.
I get that.
Which currently does not exist.
Yeah. So, I really appreciate your efforts on this, and look forward to, maybe something that's concrete that we can actually put into
I expect some feedback.
Well, I think it's all good. I mean, I don't want to make it too onerous either, but I want to guarantee that this is not happening. I think it's bad. I mean, it's like being careless and setting a forest fire. You just don't do it. You take the proper precautions to guarantee that it doesn't happen.
And like once you look through this, we both know that we have the ability to stop the vast majority of them.
Yeah.
By taking the right precautions.
Right.
You don't have the presentation, no, we do, never mind.
I missed it too the first time, but apparently it is there.
It is there, okay, so I just wanted to make sure we had the information to choose from, so, okay.
My only feedback, Mr. Medlarz, would be I appreciate trying to apply balance to using the current framework that's there while not putting a heavy thumb so quickly, because it is going to be new to the development community as they consider this. So, and then you have them in like a tiered or almost escalation. I like number 3 on this one. I think it's a good balance. And then we'd have to go back to the other ones, but I think we'll get more into that as we go.
Yeah.
I can see the complexity of it. It's kind of,
I expect to see you back in my office.
I got a note on my computer. You can check it.
I just want to thank you too, because obviously this is something I really care about and talk to you about and ask you to work on. So I really appreciate it. It's a lot for me to absorb today, so we will have further conversation. But I hope we can move expeditiously on these issues and get these things solved quickly.
Thank you, Ms. Graham. It's like as I said, it's a highly technical issue, but it's I've myself designed a number of the county's stormwater systems over the years, and so it's dear to me that we do a better job.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next.
Moving on.